Bien, buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a continuar con el ciclo de conferencias de Tribuna de Asia Oriental. Hoy es una conferencia realmente muy especial. Tenemos con nosotros al profesor Gregor Benton. El profesor Gregor Benton ha sido un profesor invitado por nuestro departamento y algunos de vosotros habéis sido alumnos suyos, o sea que ya le queda poco tiempo de estar con nosotros y esto lo pensamos desde el primer momento, que sería importante que impartiera una conferencia sobre el tema que hoy va a tratar, dado que desde el comienzo de su carrera investigadora él ha dedicado una especial atención a este tema. Él comenzó su tesis doctoral, de hecho, de algún modo está relacionada, es sobre el nuevo ejército, es un gran experto sobre el Partido Comunista Chino, sobre todo en su primera fase. Es lo que más ha trabajado. Tiene una larga lista de publicaciones sobre este tema, la primera del año 80, que son Memorias Chinese Revolutionary Memories, de 1919 a 1949. Otro tema que ha trabajado tiene que ver con disidencia política, dentro también de lo que es toda la dinámica del Partido Comunista y la creación de la República Popular China. White Lilies, del año 84, Poisonous Weeds, Dissident Voices from People's China. En el año 94 escribió Mountain Fires, The Red Army's 3 Years War in South China, del 34 al 38. En el año 96, China's Urban Revolutionaries, Explorations in the History of Chinese Trotskyism. Este es precisamente el tema que hoy va a desarrollar, porque él ha continuado haciendo investigación sobre trotskismo chino. Tiene muchas más publicaciones relacionadas con este tema del Partido Comunista Chino, insisto, especialmente en su primera fase. Otra línea de investigación diferente es sobre migración internacional china, pero eso no va a ser ahora el momento. Eso mañana estáis invitados a otra conferencia que dará en el CSIC en Barcelona, precisamente tratando un aspecto de la migración internacional china que de algún modo tiene que ver, porque bueno, hay una relación, porque es la migración china en Cuba, su participación en la revolución. De algún modo hay una internacionalización, que al fin y al cabo esto es el trotskismo, ¿no? Es una visión de la revolución mundial. Bien, es un gran honor tener con nosotros al profesor Gregor Benton, profesor emérito de la Universidad de Cardiff, investigador en estos momentos en la Universidad de Malaya, en Kuala Lumpur, y profesor invitado de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. El título de su conferencia, la que va a dar hoy, es Prophets Unarmed, Chinese Trotskyists in Revolution, War, Gaol and the Return from Limbo. Cuando quieras. Gracias, profesor Benton.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to be talking about the Trotskyist movement in China, and it did seem to me when I thought about how to present this theme that Trotskyism is perhaps less familiar in Spain than it is in other Western European countries and North America. And I then realized that there's actually quite a strong tie between Trotskyism and Barcelona, and what I was thinking of in particular was Andreu Nin and Joaquim Maurin and their party established in 1935 on the basis of the earlier Trotskyist movement. And this, of course, this movement was driven underground in 1936 by the Stalinist party in Barcelona during the events of May, Los Hechos de Mayo, and it was further suppressed, of course, by Franco, and the Trotskyists were therefore less visible in this country than they were elsewhere. And so I thought it perhaps necessary to start by saying a few words for younger people here about the politics of Trotskyism. Please do forgive me if I'm telling you something that you know already. Trotsky was Lenin's close political ally in 1917, and he differed from Stalin in the course of his career on several grounds. He opposed Stalin's strategy of building socialism in a single country, and he said instead that proletarian revolution should be spread across the world by a policy of internationalism. And he also argued that Soviet power should be based on mass democracy and workers' control, and he denounced the unaccountable bureaucracy that developed in the Soviet Union after Lenin's death. He was deported from the Soviet Union in 1928, and he was assassinated by a Stalin agent in Mexico in 1940. While he was in exile, he tried to build a new international organization, which he called the Fourth International. Lenin's International was the third. Its most important section outside Russia was in China. In Europe, Trotskyism was initially more or less wiped out by Stalin and Hitler in the Second World War. But after Khrushchev's revelations in 1956 about Stalin's crimes in the Soviet Union, there was a Trotsky renaissance in Britain, Germany, France, and a number of other countries during the youth rebellion of the 1960s. This receded 10 to 15 years later, but today there's a renewed interest in Trotskyism in parts of Western Europe among young people, just as there is among anarchism, for both the early Trotskyists and the early anarchists were heretics who capture the mood of contemporary youth movements. Both Trotsky and Max Stirner and the other anarchists criticized capitalism, but from different perspectives. But they also criticized bureaucratic socialism, and in the current crisis of capitalism, both currents are once again winning support. There were, until very recently, no studies on Chinese Trotskyism in China itself, and very little has been written about them in the West, apart from my own work. So that's why I wanted to talk with you about it. Maybe I can just say a few words about this rather Gongoresque title of my talk, Prophets Unarmed, Chinese Trotskyists in Revolution, War, Jail, and the Return from Limbo. You probably reckon, well, you may not, but the Prophets Unarmed is a tag from Machiavelli's work, Il Principe, in which he said, if you look at the bottom, you can see the Spanish summary of his ideas. He said that los profetas armados han vencido y los desarmados se han arruinado. And he then went on to say that el pueblo es variable. In other words, people change their ideas. And he said, if you have an armed force, then it's easier to stop them changing their ideas too often, which is a rather sinister thought. The Prophet's Unarmed tag has been applied on several occasions by commentators to Chinese Trotskyists, because unlike and also to Vietnamese Trotskyists, because in both these countries the official Communist Party established itself through armed force in the form of a revolutionary army. Trotskyists lacked an armed force, in fact, on the whole stayed away from the idea of carrying out a revolution by military means, and as a result they were defeated. So they're often in descriptions of them called prophets unarmed. The other bits of the title of the talk have to do with the Chinese Trotskyist participation in the Communist Revolution, their failure in the course of the war against Japan to establish themselves as a pole of resistance, their record of imprisonment, which is greater than that of any other group, I think, in the history of Chinese revolutionary work, and even for that matter of world revolutionary efforts. I think it was Blanco who was known as the longest standing communist or revolutionary prisoner of conscience in history. He was in prison for 32 years. Zheng Xiaolin, the leader of the Chinese Trotskyists, was in prison for 33 years of his 97 years. He lived until a very old age, and he was therefore the longest imprisoned of any revolutionary that I know of. The return from limbo, what do I mean by that? Well, at first I was going to call it the Chinese communists in the Chinese Trotskyists in Revolution, War, Jail and Purgatory, but then I thought that purgatory suggests some sort of sin or crime, and it always seems to me that they were innocent of most of the accusations and charges laid against them, so I chose the word limbo. Limbo is a Spanish word as well, isn't it? It suggests a state of innocence, but waiting perhaps for recognition as such. A friend of mine, when he saw this original title, said you shouldn't say just the limbo, you should say the return from limbo, because it sounds more optimistic. So I called it the return from limbo. I'm not very good at technology, so I keep on having to stop to work out where to go on. Right, the Trotskyist opposition emerged in the Soviet Union in the 1920s in response to various Soviet and international issues, and among them the Chinese Revolution was paramount, extremely important in the formation of the early Chinese opposition. Stalin in the mid-1920s was making his ascent into the unchallenged leadership of the Soviet Party. Stalin's interpretation of the international situation was quite bleak and pessimistic. He sensed that the Soviet Union had become isolated, and he believed that through playing a diplomatic game with the emergent nationalist forces in China, Sun Yat-sen and later on Sun Yat-sen's successor Chiang Kai-shek, he could relieve this isolation by finding new allies for China, for Russia, for the Soviet Union against the West. He was, through the Communist International, which controlled the parties of the communist movement across the world, he manipulated the Chinese communists, and he hoped the Chinese Revolution into serving, as he saw them, the interests of the Soviet Union. On Moscow's instructions, the Chinese communists joined an alliance with the Kuomintang, which was an authoritarian party, populist in rhetoric, but tied to defending the economic interests of business groups and rural elites. This united front into which the Chinese communists went on the orders of Stalin were in practice disadvantageous to them. The terms of the United Front required the subordination of the Chinese communists to Chiang Kai-shek and his policies. The Soviet leaders' aim in promoting this united front in China was to gain allies for Russia against the West. So for reasons of self-interest, they turned a blind eye to the friction that grew up between the two Chinese parties in 1926. And then, as I think many of you know, in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek unilaterally ended the alliance and killed thousands of communists in Shanghai. It's fairly well known that Trotsky opposed the terms of the United Front in China and said that the Chinese communists should leave it. It's less known that the Chinese communist leaders themselves, in particular Chen Dushou, the party's founder, also opposed the decision to enter the Kuomintang in 1924. In fact, Chen Dushou and the Chinese communists opposed entry into the Kuomintang several years before Trotsky himself made his opposition to the alliance public. And Moscow only managed to persuade the Chinese communists to submit to this instruction to join the Kuomintang by playing on their sense of communist discipline. Throughout the period of the United Front, which ended in 1927, Chinese communist leaders kept up their private opposition to it, but then didn't express it publicly. Historians have often argued, talking about Trotskyism as an international movement, that it was almost exclusively a Soviet thing, and that the parties that Trotskyists formed outside the Soviet Union were artificial transplants and that they were incapable of independent growth. But the Chinese communists' reluctance to accept Stalin's policy on the United Front, just as Trotsky later on also expressed his opposition to it, suggests that at least on this issue they were Trotskyists before Trotsky was a Trotskyist. On another issue too, many Chinese communists seem predisposed to sympathize with Trotsky's analysis. In Trotsky's critique of Stalin, party democracy figured strongly. Unlike Stalin, Trotsky was not a narrow nationalist or a Russian obscurantist, and he favored an enlightened politics which was founded in European rationalism and democratism. The official Soviet party, on the other hand, in the course of the 1920s after Lenin's death, became increasingly nationalist and authoritarian. And here too, I would argue, a connection can be made between the early Chinese communists and the Russian Trotskyists. Most early communist parties in the world emerged from splits in the labor movement, but the Chinese Communist Party was born of a movement for democracy and science, the May 4th movement, which is the culmination of the new culture movement of the late 1910s, which was actually led by Chen Dushou, who was its inspiration. Chen Dushou later became China's best-known Trotskyist. He founded the Trotskyist Party in 1930. He started his revolutionary career as a Democrat, and he maintained his attachment to democracy throughout his life. During his leadership of the Communist Party in China, he ran it in quite a different way from Mao Zedong. He even encouraged anarchists to join it. The official Chinese party, on the other hand, after Chen Dushou's expulsion from it in the late 1920s, underwent a process of Bolshevization. This process started around 1924, and communist parties all around the world were subjected to this process, an importation from Moscow of a regime of iron discipline and extreme centralism. So in that sense, Chen Dushou found it impossible in the long term to reconcile his affiliation to the Chinese Communist Party on two grounds. One, the grounds of the alliance with Chiang Kai-shek, and secondly, this question of the degeneration of the internal life of the Communist Party and of communist parties everywhere in the world after the mid-1920s. Chiang Kai-shek's massacre of Chinese communists in 1927 led to a bitter dispute between him and Trotsky. Trotsky said that the Chinese communists should recognize that a defeat had happened, and that they should draw the lessons of that defeat, and that they should rethink their strategy. But Stalin was unable at that time to allow that a defeat in China had happened, for he had, after all, authored the policy that had led to the defeat in the first place. Stalin argued instead that the revolution in China was in a trough between waves, he said, in a small trough between waves, and that victory was still possible. Chen Duxiu in Shanghai arrived independently of Trotsky at a position not incompatible with Trotsky's position. Chen Duxiu began to express openly the criticisms of Stalin's policies in China that he had previously expressed only in the party's internal bodies. He also lamented his own role in implementing that policy, because even though he disagreed with it, he let himself be pressured into carrying it out. Like Trotsky, Chen Duxiu could see no immediate prospect of a new high tide of revolution. Also, like Trotsky, he proposed concentrating on economic issues as a way of reconstituting the smashed labor movement. Both men, Trotsky and Chen Duxiu, concluded quite independently of one another that the defeat in China required a strategy of retreat and retrenchment, whereas Stalin minimized the defeat and still called for urban insurrections. But for a while, Chen Duxiu failed to act on his convictions. He was depressed. 2 of his 4 sons had been killed in 1927 by Chiang Kai-shek's forces during the massacre, and this made him despair. And he retreated for a while into his misery and left active politics to other people for several months, starting in about 1927-28. But although Chen Duxiu himself remained temporarily passive because of his tragedy, a group of his supporters tried to rally an opposition within the Chinese Communist Party. These people were called the Chen Duxiuites at first, and they later formed the core of the future Chinese Trotskyist Party. In August 1927, the Chinese Communist leaders, acting on instructions from Moscow, replaced Chen Duxiu as leader, and they blamed him for the crisis that the party was facing. Because although he was implementing a policy fathered in Moscow, he nevertheless seemed to have been its main supporter. The Chen Duxiuites criticized the party for sacking Chen Duxiu. They criticized it for denying that a defeat had happened, and they criticized it for blaming Chen Duxiu for mistakes that Stalin had actually forced on him. And they also criticized what they saw as the party's moral decay, its denial of internal democracy. So the Chen Duxiuites' views corresponded with Trotsky's in Moscow on 3 points, although the correspondence was coincidental rather than organized. They thought the Chinese Communist Party should have remained independent of the Kuomintang. They thought its immersion in the Kuomintang had caused its defeat, and they thought that its organizational practices were in decay, a criticism that unconsciously echoed Trotsky's criticism of the degeneration of party norms in Russia. The Chen Duxiuites lacked political confidence and a justification in Marxist theory for their beliefs. They'd come very rapidly to Marxism. They didn't understand its tenets. They'd not read Marxist texts. They lacked confidence in their judgment on issues of theory and political strategy and so on. Quite understandable. Most of them were very young and very inexperienced, apart from Chen Duxiu. And they lacked this justification and confidence. But in 1929, something happened that changed this. Young Chinese began returning to Shanghai from schools in Moscow, and these people provided the theoretical justification for Chen Duxiu's critique that Chen Duxiu himself lacked. Several hundred young Chinese communists had fled to Moscow on party instructions after the defeat of the revolution in 1927. They'd gone there to study at universities in Moscow, set up by the Communist International. And in Moscow they became acquainted with Trotsky's views, especially his views on China, which of course were dearest to them and which they knew best. And many of them became Trotskyists. In 1929, hundreds of these young Chinese Trotskyists were arrested, but dozens of them evaded arrest by pretending not to be Trotskyists, and they trickled back into China, and in China they formed oppositionist nuclei, and through these nuclei, oppositionist documents by Trotsky reached Chen Duxiu, who accepted Trotsky's point of view. Most of the Chinese who had become Trotskyists in Moscow at first hated Chen Duxiu. They bitterly opposed him because they blamed him for implementing the policies that had led to the defeat in 1927, quite understandable. There were also doctrinal disagreements between them and Chen Duxiu. Chen Duxiu was an independent-minded person. He was the same age as Trotsky, and he and Trotsky saw each other as equals, whereas Trotsky's relationship with most of his younger followers was more fatherly and inspirational and authoritative, but that wasn't the case with Chen Duxiu's relationship with Trotsky. So Chen Duxiu was not afraid to express different opinions from Trotsky's, and one difference in 1928-29 was that Chen Duxiu called for what he called a democratic dictatorship, rather than a dictatorship of the proletariat. These are all arcane and mysterious slogans. You needn't worry about them too much. But certainly it's true that Chen Duxiu put more emphasis on the democratic element than Trotsky at the time. The Chinese Trotskyists from Moscow opposed Chen Duxiu's slogan of a democratic dictatorship, and they denounced him. They said he's still the same old stinking opportunist as he was in 1927. However, Trotsky intervened from his exile at that time in Turkey to tell his young followers in China that Chen's position was actually acceptable. It was simply a popularization of the standard Marxist formula, and he urged them to unite under Chen Duxiu, which they did in May 1931. And thus the Chinese Trotskyist movement was born. But very soon, within weeks and months, all its followers had been swept into prison by Chiang Kai-shek. The Chinese left opposition was among the largest of the Trotskyist opposition, the largest of the Trotskyist oppositions outside Russia. And it was also the best prepared and the most able, because it had been through a revolutionary experience that other Trotskyists in other countries had not. Trotsky saw it as the cream of his movement. The Chinese Trotskyist criticisms of the official party's errors and excesses were often very incisive and difficult to argue against, even from within the party. The Trotskyists had predicted the defeat of the Soviet that Mao set up in the mountains of South China after 1927. And after 1949, the Trotskyist criticism of Mao Zedong's idea that capitalism would last for decades, this is what he said in 1949, was soon confirmed when Mao Zedong took rapid steps to curb the capitalists in China. Also, the Chinese Trotskyist prediction that socialism without democracy in China would lead to endless crises after 1949 was also borne out. The Trotskyist impact in China on the official Communist Party in 1929-1930 was considerable. Those who became Trotskyists included Chen Duxiu, founder of the Communist Party, dozens of senior veteran communist cadres, and a good half of the Chinese in Moscow. Chen Duxiu's defection worried Stalin greatly. Chen Duxiu was a giant in the Communist International in that period, and Stalin was worried about his defection, and he continually asked anxious questions about Chen Duxiu's intentions and his resources and his influence and so on. In 1931, the Chinese Trotskyists' prospect looked bright because the official party was in disarray. It had changed its leader 4 times in 4 years by 1931, after all. The Trotskyists, on the other hand, were freshly united under the party's founding father, and they had an explanation for the defeats, and they claimed to know the way forward. So Chen Duxiu's challenge in 1930 to the official party threw it into confusion, and even many communists who didn't become Trotskyists in that period wanted the rift, wanted the split with Chen Duxiu healed. Because of Chen Duxiu's special standing and the sympathy he enjoyed in the official party, the communist leaders in China at first treated him very cautiously. They didn't openly criticize him for a long time. Only later did they denounce him and the Chinese Trotskyists as traitors. And this was an echo in the late 1930s of Stalin's denunciation of Trotsky as a Nazi and counter-revolutionary. This campaign to denounce Chen Duxiu as an agent of Japan was started by Wang Ming, who was a young man who left China in 1920, 1921 perhaps, when he was very young, 17 or 18 years old. He had no experience of revolutionary politics or activity. When he went to Russia, he rapidly became acclimatized, a sort of hothouse, you know, of Stalinist instruction there. He ended up speaking better Russian than Chinese, and he was very fluent in the political idiom of Stalinism in the late 1920s and the 1930s. He was a big threat to Mao Zedong. He was Mao Zedong's main opponent in the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party until his defeat in the late 1930s, until Wang Ming's defeat in the late 1930s. Mao Zedong had many differences with Wang Ming, because Wang Ming always tailored his policies to suit the interests of Moscow, whereas Mao Zedong, as someone who'd never left China until 1950, tailored his policies to suit the interests of the revolution in China. So Wang Ming started up this campaign to criticize Chen Duxiu, and he was echoing what his political masters in Moscow had taught him, you know, about the ways to slander and to destroy people's reputation. Wang Ming's campaign, which Mao Zedong couldn't openly oppose for obvious reasons, created a deep fear and hatred in the Chinese Communist Party among veterans for Trotskyism and also for Chen Duxiu eventually. In 1938, Wang Ming returned from Moscow for a second time, and he made the word Trotskyist synonymous with Japanese spy through a number of articles that he published in Jiefang Zhibao. Just as I say, Trotsky himself was a Hitler agent in Soviet parlance. But it's very interesting to note that Mao Zedong himself didn't support this campaign openly. Why were the Chinese Trotskyists ultimately so ineffective? Because they were ineffective. One reason for their failure was the unending repression they experienced. The Trotskyists were China's most persecuted political minority. Unlike Trotskyist groups in other countries, they were attacked from all sides. The Kuomintang state terror defeated them in the cities, while the communists killed them in the villages and slandered them as agents of Japan in their publications. Revolutionaries in many countries face state terror, but the Chinese Trotskyists were equally hated both by the government and by a highly organized opposition with its own repressive mechanisms. It's probably impossible to find the same pattern anywhere, say Vietnam, where the Trotskyists were likewise destroyed between two opposing forces, the Viet Minh and the French colonial authorities. And also, of course, Barcelona in 1937, when Andreu Nin was and his movement, POUM, were destroyed by, first of all, by Stalin's agents in the international brigades, I'm ashamed to say, and also by the by Franco's forces. All parties in China that tried to follow a third way independently of either the Kuomintang or the Communist Party were obliterated. Only those that leaned either to the Kuomintang or to the Communist Party survived. And the Trotskyists refused to compromise, and they took the consequences, which were long, long, long years of imprisonment. They also suffered, of course, they suffered persecution in the Soviet Union, where they were sent to the Gulag or executed in their dozens. We don't know the number. The archives are only recently beginning to be studied, but we do know that this happened to a certain extent. In Mao Zedong's red bases in southern China and later in northern China, the Trotskyists suffered persecution, and also in exile after 1949 at the hands of colonial police, the French colonial police in Vietnam, who collaborated with the Viet Minh to destroy various Trotskyist groups and to kill Liu Jialiang, the Chinese communist representative, Chinese Trotskyist representative in Vietnam. In Hong Kong, where Wang Fanxi was arrested and deported in 1950, and so on and so forth. And the last great repression of the Chinese Trotskyists was in 1952, Christmas Day 1952, when those who had stayed behind in China were netted up by the authorities, something like 1,000 of them, and sent to prison and stayed there, and many of them, the main leaders of them, until 1979. So Trotskyists suffered a long record of imprisonment. They also suffered because of their own inability to unite. You know, this is quite common on the revolutionary left, where differences of personality and ambition and so on prevent organizations cohering and lead to constant splits. After the Chinese Trotskyists were freed from prison at the start of the Japanese War in 1937, they regrouped briefly as a party, but in 1941 they split, and they never reunited again after that split. I won't go into the grounds for the split, they're quite arcane, but the two organizations that were set up on the basis of the split were under Peng Shuji. He set up the Revolutionary Communist Party in April 1949, and then Zheng Qiaolin and Wang Fanxi, who set up the Internationalist Workers' Party also in 1949. Together these two parties had several hundred members. Peng Shuji's group left China. They decided to get out of China and save themselves by going into exile. And they left just before Mao's army swept into Shanghai in 1949. And Zheng Qiaolin's group remained in China, even though they sent Wang Fanxi abroad as their representative abroad. And they decided that in China they would try to organize a workers' movement under the Maoist regime, which of course failed because they also ended up in prison very shortly after. The Chinese Trotskyists also failed because they lacked money and resources to maintain their activities. You know, this is something you've got to think about in poor countries. Poverty explains why most of the members of the Chinese Trotskyist movement were intellectuals, writers, because these people could do translations in their spare time. You know, they could keep body and soul and their families together, whereas the official party was funded from Moscow, and it was much easier to maintain yourself in the official party than in the Chinese Trotskyist party. It's also true that though many of the criticisms that Chinese Trotskyists made of official policy were sound, their own strategy was short-sighted by comparison with Mao Zedong's. The Chinese workers had been neutralized by the defeat in 1927, by the Kuomintang repression in the 1930s, and above all by the Japanese occupation after 1937 of all of China's main industrial centers. The Trotskyists, unlike Mao Zedong, failed to realize that for the revolution to succeed, it was essential to start organizing the peasants even before the movement in the towns revived. They pinned their hopes exclusively on the industrial proletariat, which was a tiny class in China, and they continued to do so even after the Japanese invasion, which radically transformed the political map of China. Mao Zedong, on the other hand, won power by establishing an invincible peasant army. Before the war against Japan, Mao had barely survived, but by spearheading peasant resistance to Japan, he acquired the means to win the civil war against Chiang Kai-shek after 1945. Ultimately, the Chinese Trotskyists failed because they were too orthodox. The early communists in China had seen their mission as undoing the pattern of the Chinese past. They saw this pattern as consisting of an endless cycle of dynastic decay, peasant revolt, and then a new despotism. And they thought that they'd found classes, modern urban classes, that could break this vicious circle. And these classes were the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and the critical intelligentsia. And the Chinese Trotskyists stayed true to this belief, which is why they stuck to the cities rather than follow Mao Zedong into the villages. So in that sense, they were Marxists in the classic mold. Even after the Japanese invasion, they still stuck to this belief that there could be no revolution outside urban culture. Mao Zedong, on the other hand, took another path, and he won victory. A popular view among scholars is that Chen Duxiu didn't understand the peasants. This is what people say. He didn't understand the peasants, and that he was incapable of Mao Zedong's leap of imagination. But in reality, Mao Zedong arrived only gradually at his strategy of encircling the cities with the villagers, after he was driven by defeat into the countryside. And it was many years before he began to talk in terms of the villagers leading the cities. Nor is it true that Chen Duxiu failed to understand the role of the peasantry in Chinese history. On the contrary, from his own point of view, he understood it only too well. The Chinese Trotskyists actively resisted a turn to the countryside and insisted on striving for a new way to save China, rather than follow what they saw as the old and fruitless way. They failed because the class of industrial workers on which they tried to fasten was too small, too thinly spread, and too demoralized by defeat. Because of their orthodoxy, the Trotskyists were bystanders in China after 1937. However, a few of them did try to create guerrilla forces in the villages during the Japanese War. Astonishingly, they included Chen Duxiu. Chen Duxiu said that the war had rendered old formula out of date. Chen's willingness to rethink his ideas led him into fights with his more orthodox comrades. He was a very reluctant recruit to this idea of armed struggle. He'd always opposed military revolution. He opposed it in 1926. He said that the Northern Expedition was a mistake, a military expedition to seize power in North China by Chiang Kai-shek. He opposed the Chinese Red Army as a mistake. He said that the communists should concentrate on social movements among the workers and the peasants. He opposed the idea in general of military means, and yet in 1937 he came out for the idea of forming guerrilla detachments. I'd like to remind you again of the title of this lecture, Prophets Unarmed, and to remind you that Chen Duxiu was aware of Machiavelli's slogan. He knew that armed prophets could seize power, but he was also unhappy about the idea because he was familiar too with the second part of Machiavelli's thesis, which is that the nature of the people is variable, and so when they stop believing, when they vary too much, the people's army can bring the people back into line with the Marxist truth. And this idea of the party army capable of defending but also of dictating to the people conflicted strongly with Chen Duxiu's dream of a revolution founded on democracy and consent. So when he embraced the strategy of military struggle in 1937, he did so with extreme mixed feelings. In any case, his venture failed. Most of the Trotskyists opposed him, refused to go along with him, and those few who did try to carry out instructions by him to form guerrilla detachments lacked the necessary skills for conducting armed struggle in the villages, and they lacked material resources, weapons. They were leterados, they were literati, and they had no experience of bearing arms. Mao Zedong and Zhu De, on the other hand, recruited in 1927 to their to their young Red Army, renegades from Chiang Kai-shek's armed forces, armed workers' pickets from the cities, bandits who had guns in the areas that they entered in the countryside, and they formed the Red Army around these people. And the Trotskyists, on the other hand, had few weapons and few people capable of using them. Instead, most Trotskyists spent the war in Shanghai organizing workers under the Japanese occupation. In a few places, a few Trotskyists cut off from Shanghai by the war organized tiny guerrilla bands, but they were wiped out either by the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army or New 4th Army or by the Japanese. The Trotskyist Wang Fanxi later concluded that the Trotskyists should have set up more armed forces. He didn't think they could have competed or won power against the communists, but at least they wouldn't have ended up as they did, he said, because their organization practically collapsed. Quite a few of them starved to death during the war or went to prison under the Japanese and were executed. Today in China, Trotskyism continues to be problematic in terms of the attitudes of the established government towards it. But it's no longer denounced today as it was, as counter-revolutionary. It's simply classified as wrong, sworda, in official documentations. The main factor in the reconsideration of Trotskyism in China in the 1990s was the rediscovery by scholars and by young people of Chen Dushou. You know, you think of it. Chen Dushou was kicked out of the Communist Party in the 1920s for advocating many of the same things as students were advocating in 1989. And so many of these young people in the 1980s and the 1990s looked with interest to Chen Dushou's ideas to demonstrate to their parents and to the government that it was possible to have a tradition within the party of openness and democracy. And many books on Chen Dushou and many collections of his letters and his articles have appeared in China since 1980. Most of them highlight his equation, you know, his making equal of socialism and democracy. After Mao's death and the freeing up of thought and historiography, Chen Dushou was reinstated in the history books as founder of the CCP, of the Chinese Communist Party. And this helped also to mitigate the treatment of the Chinese Trotskyists by scholars. But the mitigation never reached to their rehabilitation as a group. The rediscovery in China since the death of Mao of the dissident writer Wang Shuwei also helped boost the Trotskyist reputation. Wang Shuwei is very famous in China now, and he was a close friend of the Trotskyist Wang Fanxi. They were schoolmates together in 1925 in Beijing. Wang Shuwei never formally joined the Trotskyists, but he did work with them before leaving in late 1930s to join the Maoists in Yan'an. And he shared the Trotskyist approach to literature and their opposition to bureaucracy and elitism. He was arrested in 1942 because of his views in Yan'an, and he was criticized for his attacks on what he saw as the party's privileges and bureaucratic tendencies. And he was also criticized for making what was a Trotskyist argument that the role of literature in a revolutionary society should be to monitor abuses by the leadership, and that creative writing in socialist society should be free to explore the complexities of the soul. He was given a show trial in Yan'an, at which he defended the Trotskyists, and later on in 1947 he was beheaded on the banks of the Yellow River during the retreat from Yan'an under attack by Kuomintang armies. And his elevation in the 1980s and 1990s also helped to bring the Chinese Trotskyists back into visibility. In China now, the old Trotskyist polemics about the nature of the Chinese Revolution are only a historical interest. No one's interested in them really. But the issue that does exercise the Trotskyists in their history The relationship between socialism and democracy is more relevant than ever today. And so is the role of the workers, who the Trotskyists believe to be central to the revolution. For today, the industrial proletariat in China is stronger and better educated than ever. But disappointingly for those of us who value the Trotskyists' integrity, courage, vision, there is little sign of a revival of the Trotskyist tradition in China. The most that can be said is there is a faint ghost of Trotskyism in some political, cultural and intellectual circles. I'm just wondering why Trotskyism is so difficult in China now to disown. I mean, they're all dead. Most of them have been dead a long time. The last surviving Trotskyist died very recently in Wenzhou. So why are they hard, even though they're all dead, why are they so hard to disown? Some scholars have contrasted Beijing's reluctance to rehabilitate the Trotskyists with Gorbachev's decision in the dying months of the Soviet government to rehabilitate old Bolsheviks killed by Stalin in 1938. But I would point out to them that even Gorbachev never rehabilitated Trotsky. Gorbachev rehabilitated Zinoviev and Kamenev, and since Trotsky was said to have been their ringleader and their co-conspirator, one would imagine that the rehabilitation would also extend to him, but it didn't. It's hard to avoid the impression that Gorbachev was prejudiced against Trotsky because Trotsky was too left-wing, too unpatriotic, and that Gorbachev's failure to rehabilitate Trotsky wasn't an accident. He preferred to rehabilitate people like Bukharin, whose memory could be mobilized in support of market socialism. In China, the leadership has tried since Mao Zedong's death to legitimize its rule by increasing political participation and doing away with naked repression. They're prepared to tolerate the exercise of rights as long as those rights remain within bounds. However, this relaxation is designed to ensure that the leadership maintains its monopoly on power, and any threat to that monopoly is met with repression, like in 1989 in Beijing. The Chinese Trotskyists were never compatible with such an arrangement. They weren't a loyal opposition within the system. They had a will to power of the sort that distinguishes opposition from dissent. They never sought to shelter behind sympathetic forces in the official world. They advanced their own full and coherent program. For many years, the accusations that Chen Dushou was a Japanese spy or a Kuomintang agent stuck. So for a long time, many veteran communists opposed the Chinese Trotskyist rehabilitation. Today, no one seriously believes that anymore. Yet rehabilitating the Trotskyists is still a taboo subject. This is partly because for the regime, anti-Trotskyism is a badge. It's a badge that says we are a monolithic system. You know, we allow certain marginal expressions of dissent, but we are basically a monolithic system. It's also because China's shift towards capitalism since the start of the reforms and the prospect in China of an independent workers' movement have intensified hostility to Trotskyism among people in the leadership who are familiar with its belief in the ascendancy of workers in the revolution. The Trotskyist association with an extreme form of democratic socialism also tells against them at a time when China's rulers associate the idea of extensive democracy with counter-revolution. So the Trotskyist rehabilitation is unlikely short of a new revolution in China. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture. We have learned a lot about Trotskyism in China, Bien, ahora abrimos a preguntas. Si queréis preguntar algo, aprovechar que tenemos aquí al profesor Benton. Bien, adelante. Yo, bueno, aprovecho, mientras os pensáis algo, aprovecho. No, me gustaría saber, vamos a ver, el trotskismo, ¿en qué medida fue miembros del Partido Comunista Chino, diríamos que tenían esta tendencia trotskista, o en un momento dado se salen del Partido Comunista y fundan partidos separados, ¿no? Has explicado el proceso, pero no me ha acabado de quedar claro cuándo llegan a crear partidos separados, ¿no? Partidos separados, o realmente eran, bueno, miembros del Partido Comunista Chino y, bueno, la corriente, diríamos, minoritaria, etcétera.
Había generaciones. La primera generación era salido del partido oficial. Después, en los años 40, había gente que no tenía nada que hacer con la tradición del partido oficial, pero que sabían que los trotskistas creen esto, hacen esto en las ciudades. En las ciudades el partido oficial no tenía una cara muy abierta, pero los trotskistas sí. De esta manera muchos estudiantes en algunas ciudades, por ejemplo en Shanghai y en Wenzhou, acudieron al partido trotskista. Hay generaciones y hay diferencias también entre las primeras generaciones que tenían un perfil muy diferente de los jóvenes que después vinieron. Tiene una voz muy alta este chico.
¿Y es posible que los nuevos trotskistas que hay en China ahora puedan cambiar la tendencia del país? Quiero decir, porque ahora China yo creo que va a tener como muchos conflictos de intereses que a su vez van a crear muchos conflictos también con la economía, y entonces, ¿hasta qué punto estos pensadores trotskistas o estos seguidores del trotskismo pueden cambiar el país, la China actual, para cambiar la tendencia del país? Porque yo supongo que no deben estar muy de acuerdo con lo que se hace ahora en China.
Sí, la tradición trotskista en China no existe ahora. Había dos partidos en 49. Un partido que fue en exilio, Peng Shuzi, otro que rimanó en China, pero que desapareció en la cárcel hasta 80. Y los trotskistas, después, I speak in English if you don't mind, tiring to speak. After 1980, many historians went to visit the old Trotskyists who came out of prison. These people were the only people left who knew about the early days of the Chinese Communist Party. In 1990, there were two people left. One was Deng Xiaoping and the other was Zheng Qiaolin, who'd been in the Chinese Communist Party at the beginning. Zheng Qiaolin had a memory like an elephant, you know, and everyone went to him, but he never became a political figure. That would have been impossible. How could he have done it? He was too old. He was under watch. Even though he was released from prison, he was still under supervision. It was very difficult for them. You know, if a new party arises in China, I don't think that the Trotskyist tradition will have much impact on it. I think it will come from within Maoism, if at all, because you know the Mao Party also has a tradition that has not been extinguished, and it's much stronger than the Trotskyists ever were. And now in the Chinese New Left, you know, old ideas about that are associated with the Mao's party are beginning to become popular again in some circles, but not the Trotskyists, if I've understood you properly. Yeah.
No lo he entendido bien. ¿Los trotskistas que se exiliaron, has dicho, dónde se fueron básicamente? O
¿Cómo?
the Trotskyists that they exile, the Penshooter,
Sí,
where
sí.
where they go? Or where they
Fueron a Vietnam.
A
Pero
Vietnam,
en Vietnam mataron a algunos de ellos, el Viet Minh.
Vale.
Y después huyeron a Francia, porque Vietnam y Francia tenían, y también el Partido Trotskista Mundial tenía su headquarters en París en aquel tiempo. Y después fue a, porque en París también tentaron de matarlo. Y fue a Estados Unidos y murió en Francia. Volvió en Francia cuando era muy viejo, en los años 80. Y los otros que remanieron en China son muertos en China. Uno en Inglaterra, Wang Fanxi, era en exilio en Inglaterra. Son todos muertos como muy viejos. Los trotskistas mueren o muy joven o muy viejo, pero son extremistas. No.
Aprovecho otra vez. No, yo creo que es interesante esta última reflexión, ¿no?, sobre el movimiento obrero actualmente en China, ¿no?, un movimiento obrero activo, cómo parece ser que no tiene como base teórica, en ningún momento considera el trotskismo, ¿no?, como que bueno, parte de otras bases o con otros intereses, ¿no? De cualquier modo, también has comentado que actualmente en China, aunque el trotskismo sigue siendo considerado algo equivocado, la visión oficial, ¿no?, de is wrong, pero por otro lado, las obras de Chen Tuxiu, etcétera, se publican. Están, no son libros prohibidos, ¿no? Es decir, están al acceso de cualquiera que quiera leerlos, ¿no? Es decir, no hay una persecución hasta el punto de que desaparezca, ¿no?, que esté prohibido realmente a este nivel, por lo menos a nivel teórico, ¿no?, a nivel de lo que es la difusión de la obra, ¿no? Eso sí que es accesible, ¿no?, a cualquiera que quiera leerlo en China, ¿no?
Mira, cuando se criticó a Mao, había una gran crisis de identidad y de conciencia entre jóvenes comunistas en China. Y Chen Tuxiu era una manera de decir, nuestra tradición es más rica, más abierta, es algo con que vosotros podéis identificaros, ¿sabes? Porque Chen Tuxiu ha fundado el partido. Se dijo en los años 70 y 60, durante la Revolución Cultural, que Li Dajiao había fundado el Partido Comunista. Pero Li Dajiao era un estudiante de Chen Tuxiu, nadie ha dicho algo de Chen Tuxiu en el periodo. Después se han reinventado descubriendo a Chen Tuxiu. Y también había el dicho shi shi qiu shi, descubre hechos, descubre la verdad por hechos. Y no se pudo negar el rol de Chen Tuxiu en el partido. Chen Tuxiu es para algunos jóvenes en China, en los 80 y 90, y ahora también, es un argumento para decir, hay otras tradiciones en el marxismo que el de la Unión Soviética, que era un gran fiasco eventualmente. Y una tradición es socialismo con democracia. Pero esto es muy difícil para el top del partido a reconocerlo. Es muy complejo, pero the more complex the better. Mao Zedong said, "Yue luan yue hao." The more chaos, the better. Well, thank you.
Muchas gracias. Una vez más, gracias.
Sí.
Muy bien, gracias. Muy interesante.
I will send you the book when it comes out.
Yeah, your new book, no?
Yeah, yeah.
With this title.
Yeah.